Kira Vasquez sat in the third row of the classroom and tried to make herself invisible. It was not easy to be invisible when you were the only human on an alien space station filled with creatures who looked at you like you might explode at any moment. She kept her hands flat on her desk and her shoulders hunched forward and her eyes fixed on the holographic display at the front of the room where Professor Thylan was teaching the class about alien biology. The other students in the room were Villani, and they were beautiful in a way that made Kira feel like a rock sitting in a garden of flowers. Their skin was pale and almost see-through, and it glowed softly with colors that changed based on their emotions. They had long, thin bodies that moved like water, and their bones were hollow like birds, and they weighed almost nothing at all. When they walked, they seemed to float, and when they spoke, their voices sounded like music. Kira was nothing like them. She was short and solid and heavy, and her skin did not glow, and her voice did not sound like music. She came from Earth, and Earth was what the rest of the galaxy called a Class 12 death world. This meant that her home planet was one of the most dangerous places in the known universe. On Earth, the gravity was strong enough to crush the bones of most alien species. The weather could kill you in 100 different ways, from freezing cold to burning heat, to storms that threw lightning from the sky. The animals hunted in packs and had claws and teeth and venom, and the plants sometimes had thorns and poison too. Even the bacteria and viruses on Earth were so aggressive that a single drop of human blood was considered a biohazard on most space stations. Humans had evolved on this nightmare world, and they had survived by being tough and stubborn and refusing to die, no matter what the universe threw at them. Their bones were dense and heavy and filled with minerals that made them hard as stone. Their muscles were thick and powerful, and their hearts pumped blood at pressures that would make alien blood vessels explode. They could survive injuries that would kill any other species instantly, and their bodies could repair damage that should have been permanent. They could keep fighting and running and working long after their bodies should have given up, because their brains produced chemicals that blocked pain and fear and exhaustion. They were persistence predators, which meant they had once hunted animals by simply following them until the animals were too tired to run anymore. All of this made humans terrifying to the rest of the galaxy. Kira had learned this the hard way in her 8 months at the Galactic Confederation Academy. On Station Helix 9, on her first day, she had shaken hands with a Villani student and accidentally broken 3 of his fingers. She had not even squeezed hard. She had just given a normal human handshake, and his hollow bones had cracked like dry twigs. The look of pain and fear on his face had haunted her for weeks. After that, she had learned to be careful. She learned to move slowly and speak softly and never touch anyone unless she absolutely had to. She learned to sit very still in her chair, because when she shifted her weight too quickly, the chair creaked and groaned and the other students flinched. She learned to open doors gently, because the first time she had pushed one open normally, she had bent the metal frame. Her desk in this classroom was special. It was made of reinforced polymer steel composite, which was the same material they used to build the outer hull of the space station. The first desk she had been given was made of normal classroom materials, and it had cracked the second week when she leaned on it while reading. Now, she had a desk that could survive a meteor impact, and she still tried not to put too much pressure on it. Professor Thylan gestured with their 4 graceful arms, and the holographic display changed to show a diagram of a human heart. The professor was old for a Villani, which meant they were about 60 years old, and they had been teaching at the academy for most of their life. They were kind in a distant sort of way, and they never said anything cruel about humans, even though Kira could tell they were afraid of her. Everyone was afraid of her. That was the hardest part. Kira had come to the academy because she wanted to learn, and she wanted to prove that humans could be part of galactic civilization. She wanted to show everyone that her species was not just a collection of monsters from a death world. But no matter how quiet she was, and no matter how careful she was, the other students still looked at her with Those nervous, flickering eyes, they still moved away from her in the hallways, and they still whispered when they thought she could not hear them. She had not made a single friend in 8 months. The professor spoke in their musical voice and explained how the human heart worked, and Kira tried not to feel embarrassed as the other students stared at the hologram and then stared at her. The Terran cardiovascular system, the professor said, pumps blood at pressures that would rupture Vellani vessels. Within minutes, their bones contained deposits of calcium so dense that standard medical scanners often mistake them for metallite ore. A Vellani student raised their hand and asked if it was true that humans could lose a limb and keep fighting, and the professor said, yes, that was true, and sometimes humans did not even realize they were injured until the fight was over. Another student asked if it was true that humans had to exercise regularly or their muscles would become so strong they would hurt themselves, and the professor said that was partly true, and that humans who lived in low-gravity environments had to be careful about bone and muscle growth. Kira wanted to disappear. She wanted to sink through the floor and fall into space where no one would look at her, like she was a bomb waiting to go off. But she did not disappear. She sat in her chair and kept her hands flat on her reinforced desk and waited for the class to end. Outside the window, the stars were beautiful and cold, and very far away, somewhere out there, was Earth with its crushing gravity and its killer weather and its stubborn, impossible people. Kira missed it so much, her chest hurt. She missed her grandmother who had survived a war and a famine and still laughed every single day. She missed her father who worked long hours in orbital construction because he wanted his daughter to have a better life. She missed feeling normal. Here on Station Helix 9, she was a monster and a curiosity, and a warning about what evolution could do to a species when their home planet was trying to kill them. Here she was alone. The class continued, and Kira sat quietly and waited and tried very hard not to think about how much she wanted to go home. She did not know that in less than an hour everything would change. She did not know that the galaxy was about to learn what a human was really capable of when the careful mask came off and the daughter of a Deathworld stopped holding back. 4. Now she just sat in her chair and listened to the lecture and kept her hands flat on her indestructible desk. For now she was just a quiet one. The sound came without warning, and it was the worst sound Kira had ever heard. 3. Rising tones that cut through the air like knives, and then red lights, flooding the room from every direction, turning the soft blue classroom into something that looked like the inside of a bleeding wound. Kira was on her feet before she even knew she was moving. Her body had reacted before her mind could catch up, because that was what human bodies did when danger appeared. Millions of years of evolution on. A Deathworld had programmed her cells to respond to threats faster than thought. The other students did not move at all. Vellani had no fight or flight response because their peaceful homeworld had never required one. When danger appeared, they simply froze like statues and waited for the danger to pass. It was how their ancestors had survived on a planet where the biggest threats were slow-moving and easily confused. But this danger was not going to pass. A voice came from the speakers in the ceiling, and it was calm and mechanical, and somehow that made it more terrifying than if it had been screaming. Hostile incursion detected, the voice said. Sectors 7 through 12, all students shelter in place. This is not a drill. Professor Thylon stood at the front of the room with their forearms hanging limp at their sides, and their glowing skin had gone pale, almost white with fear. Everyone stay calm, the professor said, and their voice was shaking so badly that the musical quality was gone. The security forces will handle this. Kira did not believe that for a second. She had read about Station Helix 9 before she came here, and she knew that the security forces were small and spread thin across a station that held almost 50,000 people. They were designed for peacekeeping and breaking up arguments and handling minor crimes. They were not designed for war. The wall on the far side of the classroom exploded inward. Kira grabbed the 2 Vellani students closest to her and pulled them behind her body as chunks of metal and debris flew through the air. Vellani were so light that lifting them was like lifting bags of feathers, and she set them down behind her without thinking and turned to face whatever was. Coming through the hole in the wall, smoke poured into the room thick and gray and choking, and through the smoke came a shape that made Kira's blood turn cold. It was tall, almost 8 feet, and covered in dark chitinous armor that looked like the shell of an insect. It had 4 legs that ended in sharp points, and 2 arms that ended in hands with too many fingers. Its head was a nightmare of compound eyes and mandibles and antennae, and it moved with the clicking mechanical precision of something that had been built for killing. Kira knew what it was. She had read about them in her Galactic history class, and she had seen pictures, and she had thought that the pictures must be exaggerated because nothing could really look that terrifying, but the pictures had not been exaggerated at all. It was a Kreth raider. The Kreth were slavers and pirates, and they were one of the most feared species in the outer systems. They attacked soft targets, like space stations and colony ships, and they took prisoners that they sold to the highest bidder. They targeted species that could not fight back, species like the Volanith Kreth. Raider swept its compound eyes across the room and saw the frozen students and the trembling professor, and its mandibles clicked together in what might have been satisfaction. Then it raised the weapon in its hands. It was a pulse rifle, and Kira had never seen one in person before, but she knew what it could do. A single shot could burn a hole through a Vellani body, and out the other side behind her, the students were still frozen, and the professor was still frozen, and nobody was doing anything because nobody could do anything. They were prey, and they had always been prey, and they did not know how to be anything else. Kira was not prey. She had never been prey. Her ancestors had hunted mammoths with sharpened sticks, and they had fought saber-toothed cats with nothing but rocks and fire. Her grandmother had survived a war by hiding in a basement for 3 weeks, with nothing to eat but rats and rainwater. Her species had clawed its way up from the mud on a planet that never stopped trying to kill them, and they had. When the Kreth raider pointed its weapon at the cluster of students behind Kira, and she could see its finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to slow down. Kira could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears like a drum. She could feel the adrenaline flooding her system and lighting up every nerve in her body. She could feel her muscles tensing and her vision sharpening and her fear transforming into something else, something older, something dangerous. The raider was about to fire, and the students were about to die, and Kira was the only thing standing between them. She did not think about what to do next. She did not have time to think. Her hand came down on her desk, and her fingers closed around the edge, and she pulled with every ounce of strength. Her death world body possessed the desk, did not just break, it shattered. The reinforced polymer steel composite that could survive meteor impacts came apart in her hands like it was made of dry clay. She held a jagged piece of it that was almost as long as her arm and had edges sharp enough to cut through bone. The Kreth raider stopped, its compound eyes fixed on her, and its mandibles stopped clicking, and for just a moment it seemed confused. It had expected frozen prey and cowering victims, and instead it was looking at a small human girl holding a piece of destroyed furniture like a weapon. It did not understand what it was seeing, but it was about to learn. Kira set her feet and raised her improvised weapon and stared at the monster that had come to take her classmates. She was not afraid anymore. She was something else entirely. Get behind me, she said to the students, and her voice was calm and steady and did not shake at all. The Vellani scrambled to obey because they could hear something in her voice that they had never heard before. They could hear the Deathworld speaking. The Vidi Kreth raider recovered from its confusion and made a chittering sound. It might have been laughter. Then it aimed its pulse rifle at Kira and fired. Kira was already moving. The pulse blast hit Kira in the left shoulder, and the pain was like nothing she had ever felt before. It was hot and sharp and electric all at once, and it burned through her uniform and seared the skin underneath. A Vellani hit by that same blast would have gone into immediate shock, and their fragile nervous system would have shut down to protect them from the agony. A Vellani would have collapsed and stopped moving, and probably would have died right there on the classroom floor. Kira did. Not collapse, Kira did not stop moving, her body flooded with adrenaline and endorphins and a dozen other chemicals. That evolution had spent millions of years perfecting for exactly this moment. The pain was still there, but it was distant now, like something happening to someone else in another room. Her heart was pounding so hard, she could feel it in her throat, and her vision had narrowed down to a tunnel with the Kreth Raider at the center. She closed the distance in 3 steps. The Raider tried to bring its weapon around for another shot, but Kira was faster than expected. She was faster than anything it had ever fought before, because the Kreth had never fought a human, and they did not know what humans could do when they stopped. Being careful, her arm came up and the jagged piece of metal in her hand drove forward and found the gap. Between the armor plates on the Raider's chest, the chitin was hard but not hard enough, and the metal punched through and the Raider made a horrible screeching sound and fell backward and did not get up again. Kira pulled her weapon free and turned to look at her classmates. 22 Vellani students and 1 professor were staring at her with expressions she had never seen before. It was not fear exactly, though. There was fear mixed in there somewhere. It was something closer to awe, like they were looking at something impossible, like they were looking at a myth that had suddenly stepped out of a story and into their classroom. "Is anyone hurt?" she asked, and her voice was still calm, even though her shoulder was burning and her hands were covered in alien blood. Nobody answered. Professor Thailand finally found their voice, and it came out as a whisper. "You are bleeding, they said." Kira looked down at her shoulder and saw that the fabric of her uniform had been burned away, and the skin beneath was an angry red color that would probably blister later. It hurt, but she had felt worse. When she was 12, she had broken her arm falling out of a tree, and she had walked home 3 miles holding the broken bone in place with her other hand. When she was 15, she had gotten food poisoning, so bad she had spent 2 days unable to keep down water, and she had still gone to school on the 3rd day because she had a test. Humans did not stop because they were injured. Humans kept going until the job was done, and then they collapsed. "It is fine," she said, and she moved toward the hole in the wall where the Raider had entered. She picked up the pulse rifle that the dead Raider had dropped and held it in her hands, and something strange happened. She had never held a weapon like this before, and she had no training with alien technology, and yet her hand seemed to know what to do. They found the grip and the trigger and the safety switch without her having to think about it. Maybe it was instinct passed down from 1,000 generations of hunters who would use tools to kill. Maybe it was something about the way human brains were wired to understand weapons and how they worked. Or maybe she was just good at figuring things out quickly, because that was another thing humans were known for. "We need to move," she said, and she looked back at the frozen students. The shelter protocols, one of them started to say. Kira cut them off. "The Kreth are not here for cargo," she said, and her voice was hard now, with an edge that made the Vellani flinch. "They are here for slaves. Every Vellani on this station is a target, and if we stay here, they will come back with more raiders, and they will take all of you." The students looked at each other, and their glowing skin flickered with colors of fear and confusion and desperate hope. "What do we do?" the professor asked. "We find the others," Kira said. "How many students are in this building?" Professor Thailand's forearms trembled as they tried to think. 37 in the classrooms, they said. "And another 15 or 20 staff members in the offices." Kira nodded and looked out through the hole in the wall. The corridor beyond was dark because the emergency lighting had failed in this section, and she could hear sounds in the distance, screaming and weapons fire and the chittering clicks of more Kreth raiders. The security forces were fighting somewhere, but it did not sound like they were winning. "Stay close to me," she said. "Stay quiet and stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run, and you do not look back." The professor stared at her with those luminescent eyes. "You are just one student," they said. "You are injured, and you are alone. and there are more of them out there. Kira smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of something that had been pretending to be tame and was finally showing its teeth. I am not alone, she said. I am from Earth. She stepped into the corridor, and the darkness swallowed her. And behind her, the Villani followed because they had no other choice, and because something in her voice made them believe that maybe, just maybe, they might survive this after all. The professor watched her move through the shadows like she had been born in them. 8 months they had known this human girl, and all that time they had seen her as a curiosity, a strange creature from a dangerous world who sat too still and moved too carefully and apologized too much. They had never seen this. They had never seen the Deathworld looking out through her eyes. I thought, one of the students whispered to another. I thought humans were supposed to be dangerous. Professor Thylan watched Kira disappear around the corner and heard the sound of pulse fire, and then silence, and then her voice calling back that it was clear. There, the professor said quietly. We just forgot what that meant. The group moved forward into the dark corridor and followed the human girl toward whatever was waiting for them. Behind them, the dead Kreth Raider lay on the floor of the classroom, next to the shattered remains of an indestructible desk. It was the first warning the galaxy would receive about what happened when you threatened the people a human had decided to protect. It would not be the last. The corridor was a maze of shadows and flickering emergency lights, and Kira moved through it like she had been hunting in the dark her entire life. In a way she had. Her ancestors had tracked prey through forests where the canopy blocked out the sun and through caves where no light ever reached. They had learned to use their other senses when their eyes failed them, and Kira found that knowledge rising up from somewhere deep inside her. She could hear the hum of the station's life support systems and the distant sounds of fighting, and the soft footsteps of the Villani students behind her. She could smell smoke and burning metal and something else underneath it all that was sharp and chemical and wrong. That was the Kreth. Their bodies produced a pheromone that humans could detect, even though most other species could not. To Kira, it smelled like danger and death, and she followed that smell through the darkness like a hound. Following a trail, they encountered 2 more raiders in the first corridor. The first one came around a corner, and Kira shot it before it could raise its weapon. The second one was dragging a Villani staff member by the arm, and Kira hit it so hard with the stock of her rifle that its chitin helmet cracked, and it went down without making a sound. The staff member stared at her with huge, terrified eyes. Can you walk? Kira asked. The Villani nodded shakily. Then, stay with the group, she said, and she kept moving. More students joined them as they went. They found a group of 6 hiding in a supply closet, and a group of 12 in a lecture hall where they had barricaded the door with furniture. Each time Kira checked them for injuries and added them to the group and kept going, because stopping was not an option and slowing down was not an option. The only option was forward. Professor Thylan moved up beside her as they approached the central atrium where the main group of students would have gathered when the alarm sounded. How are you doing this? The professor asked quietly. Doing what Kira asked. She was watching the corridor ahead, and her finger was resting lightly on the trigger of her rifle. All of this, the professor said. You are injured, and you have never been in combat before, and you are fighting creatures that have been raiding ships and stations for centuries. Kira was quiet for a moment. On Earth, she said, there is an animal called a honey badger. It is small and not very impressive to look at, and most predators think it will be an easy meal, but the honey badger does not care how big the predator is or how dangerous it is. The honey badger fights back with everything it has, and it does not stop fighting until it wins or dies. Humans are like that. We do not know how to give up. We do not know how to stop fighting when someone we care about is in danger. It is not courage exactly, because courage means you are afraid and you do it anyway. For use, it is more like a switch that flips in our brains, and suddenly fear does not exist anymore, and pain does not exist anymore, and the only thing that exists is the need to protect. The professor stared at her. You care about us, the professor said. You care about the students. Kira glanced back at the group of Vellani following her. They were terrified. And some of them were crying, and they were so fragile that she could have broken any of them with her bare hands. But they were hers now. She had decided that somewhere in the classroom when she had grabbed those first 2 students and pulled them behind her, they were her people, and she was going to get them out of this, or she was going to die trying. You are my classmates, she said simply. That is enough. They reached the entrance to the central atrium, and Kira held up her hand to stop the group. She could hear voices ahead and the clicking sound of Kreth's speech, and underneath it all, she could hear crying and whimpering and pleading. She looked through the doorway, and her heart sank. The central atrium was a large open space with a high ceiling, and plants growing along the walls and fountains that had been designed to make the space feel peaceful and welcoming. It did not feel peaceful now. There were at least 16 Kreth raiders spread throughout the room, and they had herded nearly 200 students and staff into the center. The aliens were huddled together in a mass of trembling bodies and glowing skin, and the raiders moved among with casual cruelty. Some of them were sorting the prisoners into groups. The young ones over here, the healthy ones over there, the old and injured ones in a pile that nobody was bothering to guard because they were not valuable enough to sell. Kira watched a raider kick a Vellani student who was not moving fast enough, and she felt something cold and hard settle into her chest. 16 raiders, 200 prisoners, 1 injured human with a rifle that only had maybe 20 shots left. Math was bad. The math was very bad on any other world, and with any other species, this would be suicide. But Kira was not from any other world. She was from Earth, and Earth had taught her that the math did not matter when innocent people were going to die if you did nothing. She turned to Professor Thylan. Keep everyone here, she said. Do not come in until I tell you it is safe. The professor's eyes went wide. You cannot fight 16 of them alone, they said. You will die. Maybe, Kira said, but I am going to take as many of them with me as I can, and that might be enough to give the security forces time to get here. And if I do not try, then everyone in that room is going to spend the rest of their lives as slaves. That is not going to happen. She checked her rifle one more time and took a deep breath and looked at the professor. Tell my father I love him, she said, if you get the chance. Then she turned and walked toward the atrium entrance, and the professor tried to call her back, but she did not stop. She did not look back. She had a job to do. Kira stepped onto the upper walkway that circled the atrium and looked down at the scene below. The 16 Kreth raiders had spread out across the floor, and they were completely focused on sorting their new merchandise. They had no idea she was there. They had no idea what was coming. Kira thought about her life and the strange path that had brought her to this moment. She thought about her grandmother, who had survived a war by eating rats in a basement, and who had told Kira stories about the old days when humans had nothing but their bare hands and their stubborn refusal to die. She thought about her father, who had worked 16-hour shifts in orbital construction so that his daughter could go to a fancy alien school and have opportunities he never had. She thought about Earth, with its crushing gravity and its killer storms and its animals that hunted in packs and its bacteria that could kill aliens with a single touch. She thought about every human who had ever looked at impossible odds and said, no, not today. Not like this. Kira climbed over the railing of the walkway and let go. She fell 15 feet and landed in a crouch that sent a shockwave through the floor. On any other species, that landing would have shattered ankles and knees and probably cracked the pelvis as well. On Kira, it just hurt. Her Deathworld bones absorbed the impact, and her Deathworld muscles took the strain, and she was moving before the Kreth could process what they had just seen. The nearest raider turned toward her, and she shot it in the face. The second raider tried to raise its weapon, and she was already there, and she drove the stock of her rifle into its throat, hard enough to crush its windpipe. The third raider fired at Her and Miston did not get a chance to fire again. She moved through them like a storm. She was not graceful, and she was not elegant. And she did not look like the warriors in the movies who danced through combat like it was choreographed. She was brutal and efficient and absolutely relentless. She took hits that should have dropped her and kept fighting it. Pulse blast caught her in the side and burned through to the ribs, and she kept fighting. A raider slammed into her and knocked her to the ground, and she grabbed it and broke its neck with her bare hands and got back up and kept fighting. Her rifle ran out of ammunition, and she used it as a club until it broke, and then she used her fists. She was bleeding from a dozen wounds, and she could feel that something was wrong with her knee, and at least 3 of her ribs were cracked, and none of it mattered. None of it mattered because the switch in her brain had flipped, and she was not Kira Vasquez, the quiet student who sat in the back of class anymore. She was something older. She was the thing that had hunted mammoths across frozen plains. She was the thing that had killed saber-toothed cats with sharpened rocks. She was the thing that had crawled out of the mud on a death world and looked up at the stars and said, "Those are mine too." The last raider tried to run. Kira caught it. 3 minutes. That was how long the whole fight had taken. 3 minutes, and 16 Kreth raiders lay dead or dying on the floor of the atrium, and Kira stood in the middle of them, breathing hard and covered in blood. Some of it was hers. Most of it was not. 200 aliens stared at her in absolute silence. They had never seen anything like this. They had heard stories about humans in death worlds and the terrible things that evolution could do to a species that grew up in a place that never stopped trying to kill them. But stories were just stories until you saw the truth with your own eyes. Professor Thylan came through the entrance with the other students, and they stopped at the edge of the carnage and stared at Kira. She said, "Are you all right?" Kira looked down at herself. Her uniform was ruined and her shoulder was still bleeding from the first wound, and the new wound on her side was probably going to need surgery, and she was fairly certain she had torn something important in her knee. She smiled. It was a tired, crook thing, but it was real. "I've had worse," she said, and the terrifying part was that she meant it. The security forces arrived 20 minutes later, and by then, Kira had organized the students and set up a triage system and was helping Professor Thylan splint a broken wing on a basic administrator. The security officers took one look at the dead raiders and the wounded human girl, and they did not know what to say. The report that went out to the Galactic Confederation was brief and factual. Single human student successfully defended academic facility against Kreth. Raiding party. 16 enemy combatants neutralized. 0 civilian casualties, but the reports were not what spread through the galaxy. What spread was the story. What spread was the whispered conversations in mess halls and trading posts and government offices. What spread was the question that every species in the Confederation was suddenly asking themselves, what else are the humans hiding? Kira went back to class a week later. Her shoulder was wrapped and her ribs were taped, and she moved carefully. Again, the way she had before. She sat in the 3rd row of Xenobiology 204 and put her hands flat on her new reinforced desk and waited for the lecture to begin. But something was different. When the other students looked at her now, it was not with fear. It was with something else. Something that looked a lot like respect. Professor Thylan began the lecture, and the holographic display lit up with a new image. "Today, we continue our study of Terran biology," the professor said, "specifically the phenomenon they call persistence." Kira listened, and for the first time in 8 months, she did not try to make herself small. She sat up straight, and she let herself take up space, and she did not apologize for being what she was. She was a daughter of Earth. She was a child of the death world, and she had finally stopped hiding. Years later, when Kira Vasquez stood before the Galactic Confederation Assembly as the first human ambassador, they asked her why humans worked so hard to be gentle. Why they moved slowly and spoke softly and treated the fragile species of the galaxy with such care. She smiled that same tired crook smile, and she gave them an answer that would be quoted for centuries. It is because we know exactly how much damage we can do, she said, and we choose not to. That is what makes us human. The assembly was silent, and somewhere out in the galaxy, a new generation of aliens looked up at the stars and wondered what it would be like to have a human as a friend. They were about to find out.